Awesome. Okay, well, we are just about time to our next presentation. Brent's given me the cue to roll on in. We want to take a moment here to introduce our next presenter, Jenifer Coulter. Jen is based out of Fernie with Avalanche Canada's South Rockies field team. She's passionate about public risk communication and mentorship in the Avalanche world. She's a part of our ITP program, active Fernie member, active with CARTA. I once saw her and Ilya Storm talk about dogs for 20 minutes, and it was like quantum physics. She's amazing. And she's going to talk about her survey of subject matter experts on snow compaction. Over to you, Jen.
Hey there. My sound working okay?
Working great.
Awesome. So in the last few weeks, my colleague Diana Sally and I were given a challenge to take a closer look at slope compaction since our field and forecasting work was cut short due to COVID. Sorry, just having some technical difficulties here. Excellent. So why did we make it sled focused? Well, mountain snowmobilers are growing consumers of Avalanche Canada's products, and there's very little research focused specifically on snowmobile compaction. And looking at the numbers, we've discovered that between 2010 and 2020, 80% of snowmobile fatalities have occurred within managed snowmobile areas. And that could be a little bit Captain Obvious that high use areas are likely to see higher numbers of incidents, but there is a feeling that compaction related assumptions and biases by recreational sledders contribute to near misses and avalanche accidents. So we can't really talk about sled compaction without first talking about managed sled areas. So in BC alone, there's 68 clubs maintaining over 18,000 kilometers of trails, much of them giving groomed access to treeline and alpine elevations. Managed sled areas go far beyond just grooming though. They often have day use cabins, they host events, and can definitely facilitate and promote avalanche safety as well. So various guides and educators have been ringing the alarm bells on the compaction topic for several years now. And Curtis Polyuk, who's a CAA professional member and a snowmobile guide, is one of those people. I remember reading his 2016 paper in the Avalanche Journal and it really piquing my interest. And he asked a good question in that paper that we used as a basis for the first step in kind of looking at sled compaction. And he asked, you know, as professionals, how do we understand the role of sled compaction in these areas? So Diana and I were thinking, you know, if we can comprehend more about how sled professionals understand and use compaction, it could serve as a catalyst for more pointed field research and how to approach public education on the topic. So in an effort to establish common themes surrounding snowmobile compaction, we interviewed 4, I'm calling them super subject matter experts. All are senior snowmobile guides from different companies, and each has at a minimum completed the CAA Professional Operations Level 2 course. We didn't want to make skier-centric assumptions about compaction, so we're really seeking out experienced risk managers from the sled industry to consider how guides are kind of interpreting and utilizing their knowledge of compaction. And then, you know, after doing those interviews, from what we learned, we were able to make up a survey of multiple choice and short answer questions. We wanted to keep it short, like under 15 minutes, that we could send out to a further group of subject matter experts who were all snowmobile guides who have a minimum of CAA level 1 training and guide in avalanche terrain in British Columbia. And the survey has kind of 4 loose categories. We had active compaction, we have compaction and decision making, and a section specifically about managed sled areas, and then also a few questions about communicating compaction. So let's kind of jump in here. I'm just reminding you that this isn't a master's or PhD thesis, but hopefully there's enough here to stimulate some discussion and share some ideas, essentially. So on the topic of active compaction, over half of the guides we surveyed are using purposeful compaction as a risk mitigation strategy for guiding. So for those of you listening that are in mechanized skiing, you might make comparisons to your maintenance modes, for example. Active compaction would be a little less relevant for those survey respondents in operations that are moving around, let's say between forecast regions or different tenures, or maybe not working every day of the week, so wouldn't be able to keep up with that kind of up-to-date historical record of slope use. But 46% agree that their operations actually have specific ways to communicate compaction to other guides. And this is not just communicating active compaction, but often compaction by recreationists as well. Despite almost half tracking and communicating compaction, only 22% of the respondents said their operation actually gives them guidelines to help determine if compaction has been met. So in terms of the guiding industry, there might be some efficiencies in sharing some of the currently established guidelines between operations to see if there's a common language that can be developed that could help with consistent communication, safety, training, new guides, and so on. I know I'm kind of interested in following up with some of these operations to see if my Avalanche Canada field team can adopt some of the techniques to find ways to communicate compaction between ourselves, but also to forecasters back at the Revelstoke office. And there also seems to be some interest from at least bigger operations in figuring out if InfoX could play a role in keeping track of slope history use, much the same way ski operations are using it for tracking explosives, ski cutting, holdouts, and so on. Someone could likely write a whole paper just on active compaction in the sled industry. Closely related is maybe how the industry is using a variety of slope cutting techniques for hazard mitigation, but also for active compaction. It's kind of a cool time to be a sled guide, and I think there's lots of opportunities for research here. So let's switch gears a little bit. I thought this result was kind of interesting. So in confirmed compacted terrain, only 10% of guides said that they would expose multiple riders to a slope, but 77% said they would expose riders to steeper slopes if it was confirmed compacted. If you think about it, mechanized ski guides expose multiple guests to avalanche slopes on a pretty regular basis, even without compaction. So sled guides are seemingly more conservative in this regard. There could be a variety of reasons for this reported result, but that culture of one person on the slope at a time appears to be well ingrained and is modeled by sled guides to their guests. So another question we asked is what layers are most challenging to confidently compact with your sled? And if we look at the word cloud that was formed from the short answers that people gave us, perhaps not surprisingly, crests and crest facet combos were common themes. Depth floor also proved to be problematic. One of the things on everyone's mind is always, but did those basal weak layers actually get compacted, or are we just building a slab? And I think the answer won't be the same everywhere or even year to year. It often depends if there's enough snow at lower elevations for access, the ground roughness in different managed sled areas. But 40% of respondents said that compaction in managed sled areas often starts with less than 50 centimeters of snow on the ground. I know I have been surprised over the years how many people seem willing to use rocks and stumps as traction with their very expensive machines. So then there's the discussion of how deep of layers should we be able to confidently disrupt with our sleds? And it maybe makes sense to ask this question, tying it to resistance or hardness in some fashion. So we asked the question posed with the given foot pen measurement. And you can see that the responses vary. We have some people thinking that with 50 centimeters of foot pen, that they could only disrupt layers, 30 centimeters or less. And we have another group thinking it would be over 60, and a whole bunch of people in between. Admittedly, there could be some confusion embedded in this question. Maybe it depends if you're thinking about tracking up a buried weak layer, or if you're thinking about actually slope cutting to cause an avalanche to disturb the weak layer. In any case, it kind of got me thinking about Exner, Hankey, and Ian Stewart Patterson's study on localized dynamic loading for extreme snowmobile maneuvers. And they were talking about kind of full throttle uphills and downhill carving. And one of the things that they noted was that for these two maneuvers, track penetration typically bracketed foot penetration. So if further research shows that foot pen relates to track pen in some kind of way, for the types of moves where we would use for active compaction, things like side hilling, throttling uphill, carving up and down the slope, maybe it could provide a quick rule of thumb as to how deep of layers a guide should be able to track out. It would be easier to have that rule of thumb based on foot pen than rather than doing some kind of big throttle uphill and having to measure track pen. So maybe there's some interesting things to think about there. So moving on to managed sled areas, we asked people in some free-form answers to tell us where they find the most compaction. And this word cloud kind of centers around trails, and probably, as we expect, we see themes like cabins, groomed terrain, access slopes, open slopes, I think. Even if they're steep, open slopes just seem easier for people with new sled skills to access. And when we moved over to asking people about where we find the least compaction in managed sled areas, the word cloud generally revolves around terrain. Oops, not sure what happened there. Stand by. Revolves around terrain. And I think it's not just terrain specifically, but how terrain helps to limit access. I don't think it's just about avalanche terrain. So things like steep trees, technical slopes with difficult access points. The words challenging and complex came up. But I think when we're thinking about what limits terrain use in managed sled areas, we do also have to consider riding ability, potential damage potential damage to a sled, or the possibility of losing a sled, are also factors that help keep terrain off limits. So after thinking a lot about these managed sled areas and looking through the survey and interview results, we were wondering if we could benefit by creating some common labels. I know labels can be problematic, but sometimes they do help us communicate. So the idea came up again and again that there are these core types of areas where you're likely to find very elaborate and consistent compaction. And we just went ahead and named those areas core. And then there's also areas within any managed sled zone, and also just outside of them, where we can expect a fully intact seasonal snowpack that's uninfluenced by compaction, even if it does get some tracks on an occasional basis. And we decided to name those zones wilderness. And then there's the hard part. There's the in-between. These are areas where there may be lots of tracks at some periods, but access is not really consistent enough for us to put that much weight in it. It's kind of these areas where sometimes the tracks in there can lure people in once there's a track in, making it easier to access. And there's a possibility for people to equate tracks in that area with stability. In any case, we're calling that area the proximity zone, essentially because it's proximal to the core. They kind of have to pass through the core areas to get to the proximity zones. So then in a separate exercise, we asked our super subject matter experts again to see, was it possible to use these labels, core, proximity, and wilderness, to mark up a managed sled area that they were familiar with? Now, we know that experienced guides really view terrain on a feature and slope specific basis, so it was hard for them to let go and be general enough for this exercise, but they did persevere. And this is just an example of something we got back. So the green would be core areas, the blue proximity, and the pink is wilderness zones. The intent is not to make maps like this available for the public. Rather, it was just for us to explore if it works to think about and label compaction in these types of ways. It also allowed us to do things like overlay avalanche fatalities after the fact and see what kind of zones they end up in. In this particular case, these fatalities ended up in the proximity zones. I know this photo is a little bit hard to see, but it also allowed us to do things like put slope shading overlays over the maps and see if we could tease out some commonalities between different categories of compaction as well. So if we can agree that it makes sense to think of compaction in 3 different ways, and the labels could change, it could start to give us a framework for how to talk about these things to the public down the road. And that kind of brings us to public risk communication. It increasingly feels like ignoring sled compaction related themes and hoping everything's going to be okay isn't really a good option. You know, do riders start to discount the avalanche bulletin when we're warning about triggering large avalanches and they're riding steep slopes in a managed sled area day after day with no results? A significant number of guides think that there definitely is a potential to overestimate risk management skills when moving from those core into proximity and wilderness zones. And 72% of them agreed that finding ways to talk to the public about these topics could improve avalanche safety. So I don't think what we're suggesting here is that we need to write a separate avalanche bulletin for managed sled areas. I'm not sure that's the right approach. We actually have a variety of communication tools beyond just the bulletin at our disposal at Avalanche Canada these days. You know, so could more of them actually highlight compaction related themes, you know, at least at critical times, maybe? So for example, maybe early season, we know we have the type of setup where we don't have low elevation snow and we have cold conditions and people are not being able to access the upper elevations that normally would get compacted early season. That's something we could warn about when there starts to be enough snow to get into those areas. We heard a presentation from Whistler about even compacted terrain within ski areas gets to be suspect with intense warming, isothermal, maybe free water in the snowpack. So, you know, maybe there's some themes there as we move into springtime. Even if we just look at the photo on the screen, oftentimes early season, we'll get a lot of compaction on the lower steep slopes, but the start zones, people can't quite reach them yet. And then all of a sudden, one day, there's enough compaction and enough coverage that people start reaching out into those start zones that are completely uncompacted and get surprised. So I think there's some themes that we should be ready to talk about with some of these other tools. So 100% of the guides that we surveyed that also teach avalanche skills training courses are already talking about sledder compaction as it relates to avalanche safety in their courses. This is despite the fact that there's actually no curriculum suggesting that they do so. We have updated the AST sled book in the last year, and it does include some information about compaction. And I'm quite sure that as we move into new iterations of curriculum updates, that compaction will fit its way in there. But it's just an example of a place where you know, these instructors are already kind of leading the charge. Interestingly, a lot of the guides said that they also bring up compaction related safety themes just with their guests, so not even teaching AST courses. Just something else that highlights that they think it's a pretty important topic. So it's kind of an abrupt transition, but sled compaction is a complex topic that deserves more research and consideration. I'm interested in feedback and ideas on ways that this can be accomplished. And I'm especially interested in being a part of or facilitating cooperation between people wanting to do research and the snowmobile industry, and especially maybe the guiding industry and education industry. Yeah, I think, we've seen a lot of presentation topics this week that focus on the ski community, and I think there's a lot of room here for further research. So we all need buddies to kind of help us out. This one is COVID approved, but a really big special thank you to my partner in this project, Diana Sally, who's already started her firefighting season. Also to Anne St. Clair from Avalanche Canada, formerly with SFU and future with SFU as well. She helped me with the word clouds and gave me some survey pointers. Ilya and James, my supervisors. And a big thank you to all the sled guides that responded, provided ideas and feedback. It's really amazing how much they were willing to offer. And then all of the people who make Avalanche Canada happen, including you and the professional community. Yeah, thanks. Move to questions.
Thanks, Jen. That was a great presentation. I think compaction is a tricky topic, and I think the way you've handled it has been great. And I know a lot of folks out in our audience deal with compaction, and the phone lines are lighting up. I'll turn it over to Brent.
First question from the floor is from Curtis Pollock.
Hey, Jen, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Great job. Thank you so much. Way to carry the torch, so to speak. You hit so many important points in this presentation. I guess just a kudos basically for carrying it on. Of course, we'd all love to help. And if you move forward, and well, when we move forward, I'm quite interested to see what we can find out. One of my largest concerns when we started this stuff was basically the false sense of security from riders within the managed snowmobile zones, which I think is a little difficult for some of our professional colleagues to understand if they haven't experienced that type of realm before, where we're dealing with a heavily compacted zone for much of the season, much of their riding or experience, and then all of a sudden they decide to maybe try something a bit new. And really they do have a very strong false sense of confidence in their decision making. And I think messaging can start earlier than maybe some of our research and our science, and I think it's something that as a group we should focus on pretty quickly. But other than that, great job. Thank you.
Thanks, Curtis. I certainly even feel that pull of the human factors, and hopefully I know something about avalanches, but even as my skills progress as a rider, that pull to kind of into that uncompacted terrain, I really feel it myself. And I do have to remind myself that, just because I've been side hilling on, 40-degree slopes in one area, I can't just go do that in this this new area I've just been able to bust into. So it's interesting because I even feel it myself. So I agree with you.
Excellent. Our next question is from James Minifee.
Hi, James.
How's it going, Jen?
Hi, good.
It's good to have you in the Yukon this year. Hey, I'm just wondering if you think there's potential for us to start developing maybe something like compaction rating. So I'm thinking of places that we have field teams from Av Canada, or we have professionals working in the field. Do you think that there's potential for something like that, so that it could be something that is developed as an input to the InfoX, or could even be added to an Avalanche bulletin for a managed snowmobile area, or a place like Fraser that you're familiar with up in the Yukon here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I'm quite ready to jump into how it could fit into the bulletin, but I do think that there are opportunities for us to learn from things that some people, at least in the sled guiding, are already doing, because they do have ways to yeah, kind of categorize the amount of compaction already and keep track of them. And I do think it would be possible for us to start including some of that in the InfoX and work with the CAA to see how we could do that. So, I mean, essentially, yes, I think it is something that we should consider, how to categorize different varieties of compaction, at least for us, and then, you know, potentially to help inform the public down the road.
Right on. Thanks, Ed.
Next question is from Steve Conger.
Hi, Jen. Just building on both last two and tossing this out to Curtis and all other InfoX users of sleds. We struggled with that in the Sled Golden and have played with a bunch of different ideas of how to describe compaction. And just throwing out ideas, the number of tracks, putting in ranges of the number of tracks you can get between existing tracks, and then categorizing it by the percentage of the run out and percentage of the start zone using the relative scale, trying to come up with ways that are easy and quick for the guides to make and record observations. And just want to toss it out there to keep everybody working on it and hopefully start a working group.
I think a working group would be a great approach, because the methods that you just brought up came up in the interviews and the surveys to a certain extent. Like, is it possible for us to kind of get on the same page about compaction by having some handrails, like you said, how many tracks can you fit between tracks, or what methods do we use, so we can kind of consistently speak the same language. So I think a working group would be a great idea.
And we've also are looking at using the control extension and how there are ways to use that.
Yeah, for sure.
Next question is from Keith Robine.
Hey, Jen, thanks for the presentation. Jen and I have already started to communicate. I'm doing some work with the AST2 curriculum instructor manual update. And I was wondering, it's kind of a question for you, Jen, as well as maybe the broader audience, about this application of compaction toward ski compaction. And as an AST instructor, inevitably that question always comes up in courses. We don't really have much guidance around how to teach compaction. We just talk about it very subjectively. And I was just wondering if anyone out there or yourself has information about how this applies in the ski world.
Yeah, I don't want to get into how it applies in the ski world from an education topic, because I'm not sure I'm quite as up to date on what's happening in the AST community and in the teaching community in that regard. But I know it is often a problem in just outside ski area boundaries, and I'm sure it's becoming an increasing problem, complexity in places like Glacier National Park, where it can be extremely busy and people can get that kind of false sense of security. And I know that for those of us that really rely and for us to put much weight in compaction, it seems like from the survey that I did and from talking to other professionals that people really are most comfortable when they have like a day-by-day history of slope use. And if we don't have that, we start to be less confident in thinking that compaction is something that we should rely on. But I think we can admit that when we're teaching. there is a difference between inside a ski area boundary compaction and outside a ski area boundary compaction as far as that slope history is concerned. Yeah, I think I'm just rambling now, but it is a complex topic, and I'm interested in working with you to find ways to talk about it in the ski and sled community.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jen. I think we'll be taking your lead on this. You know, the skiers will have to just follow the sledders because you guys are at least approaching this more directly. And thanks.
All right, the hands are lighting up, Jenifer. We're going to have time just for one more question from Scott Wixon. The rest of you folks there, I've got another 6 in the queue. If you could see Jen's email address on the screen, and you could possibly contact her locally to herself.
Hi, Jen. Are you
Hi
able
there.
to hear me? Hi. Hey, I'm not really involved too much in the sled community, although I've been around it peripherally. And I found I'm working at Sunshine Village as a forecaster there, and we do a lot of compaction for maintenance in our area, even in pretty extreme terrain. And we use the InfoX to record it all. And I'm just wondering if you guys, it's a really good tool that's really helped us in managing our compaction, and even to the number of people in the zone that's doing the compaction, and you can even add photographs and whatnot. And it really gives us a good indication on what's been compacted when, and if it's a maintenance issue, if we're trying to beat up certain soil layers or more commonly facets and whatnot. But I just found it's a really useful tool for us, and I'm just wondering if you guys have thought of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it would be great to have some kind of working group with the sled community and InfoX, looking at ways that we can start recording and speaking the same language about compaction. And it may actually be worthwhile to have some people involved who are already using it for compaction related topics, even from the ski industry, to help provide some insights on what's worked and what hasn't in the past. But I think, you know, that's not going to be a perfect solution for everyone in the sled guiding community or every managed sled area. But I think for a lot of the bigger sled guiding operations and maybe bigger managed sled areas that are already have forecasters kind of working for them to help decide when grooming and things should be done, I think there is definitely, InfoX could be a good tool. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Hope it all works out.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for that last question. Jen, obviously compaction is a topic where
Sorry, Joe, here. We just had a glitch with our sound. Just bear with me.
sure. Standing by, Brent.
You're good to go.
Okay, thank you. Jen, sorry about the technical glitch at the end there. I think folks are really excited to watch this work continue, whether you carry that torch or others. It's great that you've done so from Curtis's earlier work, and I think a lot of folks will email you.